Thank you very much. There you go. All ready? It's ready to go. Watch your language.
Hello, everybody. We're started here. Can you hear me? Huh? No? No?
But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
How's that?
Better. A little more.
Gee, I can't get any much closer here.
Put it like this. Like this.
Oh, this. Okay. Is that better now?
Yeah.
Okay. What? Still louder?
Yeah.
I'm going to have to shout here.
Well, he can get it up maybe.
Yeah, okay. So welcome to the to the kickoff of the 7th annual Tony Wyatt History Festival. And this is sponsored by the Washburn Area Historical Society and the Washburn Heritage Association. And we give a big thanks to the Washburn Community Education Foundation for their support of this winter series. The museum this evening, the musician this evening is Randy Sabine, and Peter Holter is sponsoring the music. We invite you to stay after. Yeah, we invite you to stay after the presentation for more music and refreshments. All our refreshments are in back there. So, and technical assistance is provided by Lynn Adams.
It's just not, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, can we get a sound check just quickly for the back? Who can hear? Who cannot hear?
Do I have to be louder?
Yeah.
Is that better? Okay. No?
Sorry.
So, and also thank you for the Harborview for hosting this series. We got a series of 4 programs, and we hope you can come to the next 3. Now I'll introduce Joe Lawson tonight. We're fortunate to have him with us tonight. And although Joe and his wife, Kelly, have lived most of their adult lives in Madison, he still tells anybody who asks that he is from Washburn. Joe graduated from the Washburn High School here. He served in the U.S. Navy and went on to law school and spent his career as a specialist in the transportation law. And Joe said he was encouraged by John Foltz and John Anderson to start telling his stories about people and places imbued with the Washburn spirit. I don't have much more information on Joe. I've tried to contact Joe. I tried to call him, and I asked a lot of people here in Washburn if I could if he knew Joe's phone number. Nobody knew Joe's phone number. And so today I googled the name Joe Mawson, and I found out that he works or he's working now part-time for the Wisconsin Transportation Builders Association. So I called them. They didn't know John's phone number either. So I never did get back to him. So it's if you want any information, you're going to have to ask him. So he says he's especially pleased to be invited back during the coldest days of the winter. and thinks that he thinks that honor must be directly linked to his reputation as a storyteller. So with that, please welcome Joe Musson as our speaker tonight.
Thank you, David. Hi, everybody. I am the mysterious Joe Mawson with no telephone number. That said, I need to correct a couple of things. Mr. Bradley suggested that I graduated from Washburn High School. One of the people sitting up here in front, if you have a chance to talk with him, will tell you that while I spent some time in the same class as he did at Washburn High School, he and other members of the class of 1967 have no record or no understanding that I actually graduated from Washburn High School. So that's a preview of what you might get tonight, that the quality of this presentation may be left to someone who has not graduated, or may not have graduated even from Washburn High School. Is it back up? Okay, well, turn around. See, I do know how to turn around. Now, as a preview to this, I have been spending a good amount of time working on a multimedia presentation on Valhalla. Sunday night, about 4:30, I was adding the finishing touches to my PowerPoint presentation. And all of a sudden, my computer went blank. And I had not backed up my PowerPoint presentation because I wasn't done with it. And I'm not very bright. You can tell that by not backing up my PowerPoint presentation. Well, Monday, yesterday, I went to the Apple store in Madison, Wisconsin, about 9 o'clock, and at 5 o'clock last night, I was still in the Apple store trying to resurrect my computer. And in the meantime, I was left imagining what I would do if I couldn't do my PowerPoint presentation. Well, my computer had a massive cerebral hemorrhage. It is in the hospital, computer hospital in Madison right now, and it may have to be taken off of life support when I get back to Madison. So what you are going to get tonight is an old school presentation. I cobbled together some of the photos I had on my phone, the one that I don't have a telephone number for, and from other places, and that's going to be the essence of this presentation. Before I start, because it is a part of this story, I was originally going to, at the end of my PowerPoint presentation, dedicate this event to a friend of mine who became a closer friend in the last few years, a quintessential Washburnite, if there ever was one. John Foltz. John passed away last May, but John was in the same vein as Tony Wyack, Lars Larson, Katherine Johnson, Mrs. Harnaw, and other great preservers of the Washburn and the Chequamegon Bay Area storytellers. He was as good in being a Washburnite as some of you will know and remember Charles Chick Sheridan, who literally preserved for Washburn pictures, countless, hundreds, thousands of pictures that appeared in the Washburn Times, the Ashland Press, the Superior Telegram and live in the archives over at the Washburn Historical Society. Pictures that go back to 1925 and before, pictures that lived until Chick passed away in the late 20th century. That was John Foltz. And the reason that this is part of the story is because John had a wry sense of humor. And John would have liked nothing better than to know, after he had encouraged me to take this Valhalla project on, that at the last minute, my computer died on me. I can see John smiling. I can see John saying, "Huh, Mawson, serves you right. You thought you knew what you were doing. You didn't know before, and you don't know now." But he would have done it nicely. That was John Foltz. And so I start the evening by circulating, because everything is by hand, by circulating this memorial of John Foltz. And what it says under his picture, and I won't do a lot of reading, this is the only part I will read. "I wish to be a quiet man," and John was. A man of moderation. John was that. No great talker. John would talk, but he wasn't someone like me who rambled on for time immemorial. No great noisemaker, but a quiet man. A worker through books and friends. A quiet doctor, a shy poet, a silent member of the wounded soul. That was John Foltz. And John Foltz and Judge John Anderson, good or bad, are the people who got me on this stage tonight to try to tell another Washburn story. So this is dedicated to John Foltz. So, the Valhalla story. Some of you probably have an idea of how Mount Valhalla came to life in Washburn, Wisconsin in the mid to late 1930s. And amazingly, it is only partially a story that is true. Most people, when I grew up, believed that Valhalla was a project of the CCC and the U.S. Forest Service. That the chalet was built by the CCC as a work project, and that Valhalla was kind of an afterthought. Well, that's a little bit like what Paul Harvey used to say, part of the story. What I learned as I started this was Mount Valhalla really came into existence because what some of you will know and remember or realize is the sibling rivalry between Washburn and Bayfield. One that includes the courthouse and other kinds of activities like that. Seems that Charles Chick Sheridan was the editor of the Washburn Times in 1935, and he was a marketer of all things Washburn. And Chick got wind, as the editor, of the fact that Bayfield was developing a winter recreation area, and that it would include snow slides and skating and a bunch of other activities. And so Chick editorialized in the Washburn Times, said, "You know what? The people of Washburn can do better. The people of Washburn can create a better winter recreation site, a more diversified recreation site than our neighbors to," it's not really the north, it's kind of the northwest to Bayfield, isn't it? Whatever. But, so that was like 1935, and not much happened. There was more talk, and famously, Chick Sheridan, and the then mayor of Washburn, who was himself a ski jumper in his youth, and an old local who was also a ski jumper, got together and saw this hill 7.9 miles from downtown Washburn and said this would make a great winter recreation site. It could be for downhill skiing, it could be a ski jump, it could be all of the things that it became in that era, if we could only get some help. And lo and behold, it was the edge of the Depression. And the Forest Service was talked to, and they said, well, we can provide the labor for a chalet and the clearing of the hills if you do the other things. And in 1935, Valhalla was born. And this picture that I pass around now will show you Valhalla in 1935. It will show you no trees on the hills. It will show you a toboggan run that was 2,400 feet long, and it was as straight could be. And on the opening day of Valhalla, they closed the upper 1/3 of the hill because the toboggans were coming out of the track, because the speeds were, according to the stories in the newspapers, in excess of 65 miles an hour. I don't know how they figured that, but that's what the story said, and they closed the upper part of that. You will see a downhill track. They really thought about alpine skiing out there, and you will see 2 ski jumps, one a 20-meter ski jump, a small one, the other a 60-meter ski jump, which for that era was super big. 60 meters means roughly 200 feet as a maximum amount of safe jump in the 1930s on wood skis in an era when ski jumping was just coming into its own. Thank you, Lloyd.
I look a lot younger than Joe, so.
Yeah, except besides looking younger, just because you look younger than me, I hate to tell people that my mental acuity is still a little superior to yours. That's a sidebar issue.
I don't understand that acuity.
Yeah, I know you don't. And if you have questions, let me pause here for a minute or redirect you. I would like you to shout them out, raise your hands, dance in the aisles, do anything like that to ask me questions as I talk about this. This next photo is an aerial of the site, and it does show the straight toboggan run. It shows what they call the professional slalom run with trees on it that they closed down after the opening day because 3 people got hurt when they tried to ski on it. And these were the days when they walked up the hill. There were no toes. There was nothing like that. So this aerial photo will show you the slalom hill, the toboggan run, what they call the regular downhill or slalom run, and the 2 ski hills. And notice, if you would, because it will become important as we move through this, because this Valhalla story is a little bit like a human life. It had a birth, it had a youth when it was very exhilarating and enthusiastic. It had adulthood. It had a period of quietness. It had a rebirth. It has changed its face a number of times. But notice the background, and notice that, yes, it's a winter photo, and there are some trees on it, but especially south of Highway C, there aren't many trees. And that becomes important because this area in 1935 was what the old people called part of the Barrens. And some of you will be familiar with that terminology. And there is still some barrens out there back towards Muckwa. But this was all part of the Muckwa Barrens. And you can see the lack of forest in this picture. Thank you again, sir. So, Valhalla was born by the hard work of Charles Chick Sheridan, Mayor Hans Thompson, and Ole, I can't remember his last name. It would have been on the slide, so you miss out on that important feature. Starting in 1936, Valhalla had a youth of, let's say, well, 36 to 41, 5 years of winter ski tournaments. And they were big deals. The Valhalla record, a hill at its highest point that is 1,288 or 1,254 feet above sea level, depending on who you look to for your information, produced jumps, a record jump, not in 2017, not in 1964, in 1940 of 193 feet. 193 feet of airborne jumping. Now, when you watch the Olympics next month, a month from today when they start, if you watch the ski jumping, the jumps will be closer to 300 feet. The hill size will be the largest hill will be 90 meters. But in the 30s, jumps of 193 feet on wooden skis with the most antiquated bindings that you can imagine were something to behold. This is a picture, and some of you may know the woman in this picture advertising the 1940 tournament, and that's when the record was made. Now there's a little sidebar, but it fits in here. Washburn got really behind ski jumping in that period, 1936 to 1941. And they created a junior ski jumping team, or club. And in January of 1941, they held a junior ski jumping tournament for the members of this club. Some of them are still alive. Sadly, they are not here tonight, but they were like 12 years old at the time. Names that many of you will know: Bobby Andy Anderson, Jack Peterson, Dick Hawks, other names like that. They didn't jump they didn't jump at Valhalla though. The ski jump club built a scaffold at the intersection of 6th Avenue West and Omaha Street, which is at the top of the 6th Avenue route to Thompson's West End Park. There were roughly, and the names are listed on this photograph: Harry Randall, James Cudmore, Leonard Roberts, Louis Malinowski, Jack Peterson, and others. Robert Sanger. I saw Bob someplace walking around. Robert Sanger was a member of this ski jumping team, or club. Now interestingly, Bobby Anderson took second place in his division with jumps of, I believe, 21 and 20 feet. Jack Peterson was right behind him with jumps of 1 foot less. And they were both 12 years old. The youngest jumper at the time was 6 years old, had 2 jumps of 15 feet. And in this year, and I do this respectfully, when I say in this year of Me Too, for those of you amongst us who have striven mightily for more recognition and more equality over the years. There was, in fact, a trailblazer woman on that ski jumping team, a woman by the name of Beverly Moe. And she competed well with the young men. She was 12 years old and had jumps of 19 feet and 19 feet. And Bev Moe was out there when nobody else was out there jumping, who were young women, and was blazing a trail for all of us, just like, and I go back just for a minute, just like a woman that none of you who have a Washburn in your blood should ever forget or ever minimize, and that is Elizabeth Hawks, who was quintessentially way ahead of her time in so many ways. The possibly third female district attorney in the United States in 1941. 1941, can you imagine a woman being the district attorney of a county any place in the United States? And she was. Now, I can't go off on that story because it's not really the Valhalla story, but there were women trailblazers up here who have played a critical role in the health and well-being of this community for years and years and years and years. Here's a rough picture of, unfortunately, what I had to do with many of these was scan these out of the Washburn Times, which is on microfilm at the Wisconsin Historical Society Library, and then I had to try to photograph them, so they don't come out very well. But it will give you an idea of what was in the Washburn Times in 1941, or 1940. Well, this is 1941, and Chick Sheridan's still trying to sell Valhalla as a great winter recreational area. Chick has this new idea before the 1941 tournament. He's going to create what is called, and I think this was done respectfully, Girls on Skis at Mount Valhalla. And what it was a photo op. According to the article in the Washburn Times, Chick sent out an invitation to all of the beautiful young women of Ashland, Bayfield, Washburn, and the surrounding areas to put on their best winter outfit and pick up their skis and come out to Valhalla for a photo shoot. And those photos would appear in the Superior Evening Telegram, maybe the Milwaukee Journal, maybe even the Chicago papers. And this is January of 1941, and the young women show up. And the pictures are taken by professional photographers. And this, again, is not a very good picture, but it is important because at least one of the people is a woman that both Lloyd and I, Lloyd having graduated in 1967, me having attended Washburn High School in 1967, and maybe or may not graduated, one of the women we knew very well. And her name, her maiden name, was Kathleen Cudmore. Her married name was Kathleen Peterson, the wife of Tom Peterson Jr. And she's the one, if you're looking at this photo on the right, you can kind of see because she has a white jacket on, but this was a big event for Valhalla in 1941. Girls on skis. The next photo that I share with you, and I want to pause and I want you to think of your own personal experiences, your own life experiences, your youth, the vigor of your youth. That first 5 years from Valhalla was like the vigor of its youth. And this is just a representation of the top of the toboggan run. You can see them, you can see how high the snow is piled. You can see the people on the toboggan. You can't tell a whole lot more. Now it's tournament time in 1941. Biggest tournament in the history of Valhalla. No question about it. And this is how they marketed it. 6 young women standing behind signs that say, "Sea Crack Ski Jumpers, 5th Annual Ski Meet, Mount Valhalla, Washburn, Wisconsin, Sunday, March 2nd. This is 1941. Maybe some of the women are familiar to somebody in this crowd. Here, this picture advertises the 1941 event. Some of the people here will know this name as not just anybody at this event, but the queen of the Valkyries. Her name, Betty Lou Anderson. And another woman who was one of the princesses, Mary Ellen Lamoury. So we're at the height of Valhalla right now. Now, the first pictures of jumping. And I want to do 2 things with this picture. As you look at it, I want you to notice this jumper. I want you to notice his style. He is leaning forward, kind of at a 90-degree angle, with his arms extended in a forward position. That was the style of ski jumping from the turn of the century until about the late 1950s. And the other thing I want you to do, because it will become important as we move forward later on, is I want you to look at the background. What you will see is a hilltop in the background, which is the hilltop of the Washburn Fire Tower. But what you will notice between this jump at Valhalla looking east and a little bit north is there are no trees. It is virtually treeless as compared to what we knew growing up in that area, and as compared to what you would see today if you drove out to Valhalla and you looked down the side roads and things like that. But notice the jumper and notice the background, because they too help tell this overall story, help connect us to this. Now this next photo, actually one of the few color photos, and designed that way by me in color, not any other way, is a member of the United States 2017-18 ski jumping team. And what you should notice is his style as compared to the style of that 1941 jumper, who may well have been one of the people who set records out at Valhalla in that era. Notice how his arms are tucked backward. Notice how his head, the top of his head is beyond the front, the tips of his skis while he's in the air. And he's not skiing and jumping on wood skis, and he's not using 1935 binder technology. Next is an example of the skis that they did use in 1941, and one of the jumpers. I had information on this jumper in my presentation. I don't have that information in this photograph, and I'm not going to try to recreate what I remember. I'm going to simply show you this and let you look at it and see how they dressed and what they did. The next photo is very telling. Tells us what emergency services were like in 1941. Tells us and shows us the kind of relief you would get. And it also tells us, or reminds us, that ski jumping is at Valhalla and landed on his head and did little damage to anything. Now the story behind this photo is that this jumper obviously fell and was injured. They took him off the ski hill on a toboggan. They took him over to the chalet. They put him in the back of an old car. They drove him into Washburn, dropped him off at what was the Washburn Hospital, went back out and did their job of ski jumping. Spent 2 days in the Washburn Hospital and was sent back to Chicago. But you can see firsthand that emergency services have come a long way. No 911 back then, no anything but a toboggan to pull them off the hill. Then, as many of you that nothing new, it's 1941, and the United States is embroiled in the Second World War. All of the young men, the Bobby Andersons, the Jack Petersons, the Dick Hawks of Washburn, many of them ended up in the military service. The person who was the caretaker at Valhalla at the time was a man by the name of Lloyd Snowball Severud. And it's important to sort of remember that name because we'll visit him again in a little while. So what happened was the ski club, and I'm not going to pass this one on, moves to suspend all of the activities at Valhalla, all of the formal activities at Valhalla for war duration. And one of the reasons was because Mr. Severud was drafted and they had no one to care for it, but it was because so many of the young men were leaving the area to serve in the war. Well, the war ended and the young men came home and they were now old enough. They had been through their birth in Valhalla. They had been through the exuberant years. They had been through the war and grown up. And now they were starting their careers and their families, and they did not have time for Valhalla. And so Valhalla lingered in the late 40s and the early 50s. There were some informal activities. There were no ski jump tournaments in that era. There were no special events, organized or otherwise, because the young people of the time, and Carla's telling me, I gotta move on, it's almost break time. And I'm just about at a good point, Carla. So Valhalla in the 40s and the 50s, other than people like Lloyd Swanson and his brother Dwayne, who would drag people like Stanley Pila and myself out to Valhalla to try different things. Washburn High School had a great program in that era. They had a bunch of Army surplus white skis, nice hard wood skis with a leather binder that you stuck your foot in. They cost $2. Washburn High School sold them for $2 a pair. And so the Swanson brothers would encourage those of us who skied at Asheville Bay and other places to buy up these skis and take them out to Asheville Bay and use them to jump off the small hill. You couldn't lose much if you broke them. What was, even back then, what was $2 for all of this fun? And one of the great sidebar stories is the days that we often did this at Valhalla in the late 50s and the early 60s were the days that Washburn High School had closed the school because the temperatures were like they were last week, 27 below zero. And we thought, well, good for us, they don't know any better. And of course, we were out at Valhalla, getting out there one way or another, because none of us were old enough to drive. But we were jumping at Valhalla, riding toboggans on part of the hill, all of that kind of stuff, on days that it was too cold to have school. It was like a blessing. It was like, wow, this is heaven on earth. They don't understand what we get to do. They closed the schools on us. Well, one of the things that I've been asked to do is to take a break in this presentation. And because things start to change in the 1960s, this is a perfect place to stop for 10 minutes, get some refreshments. I've bored you to death. I've gotten no questions yet. I've seen at least 47 people leave. Fortunately, most of you are looking this way, so you haven't seen them and haven't had to be embarrassed for me, but nonetheless, that's life on the big stage. So with that, I will say, let's take a break, and apparently we'll get back here in about 10 or 15 minutes. Thank you. In our Valhalla story, it is the early 1960s. Someone in the audience came up and said, could you at least give us, some of us, a little background on who owned the property that is called Valhalla all the way back to the 1930s? And the question is quite easily answered. It is, has been, and was for a long, long time owned by the U.S. Forest Service. And the U.S. Forest Service contributed the first timber harvested in the Chequamegon National Forest for the construction of the original chalet. The U.S. Forest Service maintained it during the years when it wasn't being used. The U.S. Forest Service insisted that the public be invited to the tournaments and things like that at no charge. And it did not charge for use of the chalet or anything like that in the early years. It is still owned by the U.S. Forest Service today. It has expanded greatly as a recreational area. And now we will slide back into the 1960s. And in the lifetime of a person, we have now, our children are now old enough to be out of the house. And that's sort of true with Valhalla. And what happens is there is a rebirth. And the rebirth is the brainchild of people that you have already heard me mention tonight. The rebirth is a collective sit-down between Charles Chick Sheridan, still working for the Washburn Times, and the then mayor, 1960 now, of Washburn, Hans J. Thompson. Now remember I told you earlier, Hans J. Thompson was the mayor of Washburn in 1936 when this started. Hans J. Thompson was the mayor of Washburn when Dwight Swanson and Marianne Lazat and Dave Anderson and all of us grew up in Washburn. His profession was, he was a barber, and his barber shop was in what you all know as, I think it's Deleuze. Is that the name of the yes. So that's where his barbershop was. But Hans J. Thompson was still the mayor. They sat down and they said, we need to revitalize Valhalla. They had an ace in the hole. Remember I told you about Lloyd Snowball Severud, how he went away to the war, how he had been the caretaker? Well, the ski jump team, the U.S. Olympic ski jump team, was having a hard time finding a place where there was sufficient snow in the wintertime, because ski jumping was not a big American sport. It was sort of a stepchild winter sport, if anything. But they knew Lloyd Snowball Severud, and it just happened that in the early 60s, Lloyd Snowball Severud became the coach of the United States Olympic ski jumping team. And they said, the three of them, Valhalla is a perfect place. Perfect place to train the ski jumper, the Olympic ski jumpers, great snow, all the things. It's decayed a little bit over the years since the war. But if we can refurbish it, we can bring the ski jumpers back. Now, remember, this is the 60s, so they didn't have big budgets for Olympic teams. They weren't dressed in fancy uniforms and all that kind of stuff. They convinced a local contractor from up here, who was also a used car dealer, was the son of Katherine Johnson and the Baker Johnson from our era, the old era, a guy by the name of Don Turbo, to volunteer his equipment and men to rebuild the jump, rebuild the landing area, do things like that. There was no longer a toboggan run. There was the 20-meter hill that they used. And the U.S. ski jumping team came to Washburn in about 1963. And they stayed until about 1968. They lived in what, for those of us who grew up in that era, is the Washburn Civic Center, or more notoriously noted to us as the DuPont Club. They lived in the gymnasium on army cots. They did their ski jumping in the morning, and the great technical advantage of the time by jumping in the morning was that they could film those jumps, rush the films to Duluth Superior, have the films reduced, and be ready for playback that evening by someone driving up to Duluth Superior, waiting for the films to be processed, driving back to Washburn, and making them available for Lloyd Severud and his staff to critique the U.S. ski jumping team. And that was the most modern of technology that people could imagine, that you could film something in the morning and you could review it that night back here in Washburn, Wisconsin. So the next photos that I will pass around are photos of those years when a ski jump team actually trained here at Valhalla. And the first one is coming down the slide. You can see the old chalet, the original chalet, built from Chequamegon National Forest, prime woods back in the 30s. And I'll start with this one and pass it around. You'll notice that the ski jumping technique in 1964 was more like the technique that you saw from the 2017 jumper. A number of these are just photos of that era of ski jump team members. It's good for your heart health. That was an inside joke. He asked me if I could hand out two at a time. I can't get any farther than this. My cord holds me here, Lloyd. So this is a picture of the ski jump team at the top of the hill in the background. Yeah, notice the skis that they used even then in the 60s. Long wooden skis, old-fashioned bindings. A couple more pictures from the 1964 era. Now, sidebar story. For the tournaments that they held at Asheville Bay in this period of time from 1964 to 1968, I told you they stayed at the Washburn Club, families in Washburn fed them, things like that. They had regroomed the hill and rebuilt it. And they would get the high school kids to come out and sidestep, the alpine skiers in particular, sidestep down the steep part of the hill to pack the snow down for the jumpers. And the administration at the Washburn High School was kind enough to let some of us out of school to do that. Their ulterior motive was that persons like Lloyd Swanson and Joe Mawson were better out on a ski hill during the school day packing down the snow than sitting in a classroom of then social sciences teacher Dave Kudrowski and sitting at the back of the room or in different spots in that room going, Mr. Kudrowski, get on with it, Kudrowski. So the administration said, put them out on the hill. They can't embarrass, they can't hurt us. And that's where we went. Now, I told you they didn't have a lot of money. They didn't. So what they did as far as grooming the bottom of the landing area, so to speak, they hired the Swanson boys. But the Swanson boys didn't really get paid for what they did. The Swanson boys were, for a variety of reasons, where they lived, not far from Valhalla, and because they had one of the first snowmobiles in the Chequamegon Bay area. They were the perfect people to call on to help out with grooming the landing area. So how did the United States ski jumping team and the Swanson boys, how did they get their minds together to come up with a way to do that? What was the way they did it? Honest to God, truth story, honest to whatever you believe in, true story. They got an old bed spring. They tied it behind the Swanson boys' snowmobile. One of the Swanson boys, to keep that bed spring somewhat stable, would sit on it. The other one would drive the snowmobile back and forth across the landing area using that bed spring as the grooming device for that landing area. Did I tell the story accurately? Yes, honest to God, that's a true story of how they groomed the hill for the United States ski jumping team in the 1960s. Now here's a photo of summer training for these elite Olympic champions here in the Washburn area. I want you to notice the uniformity of their training gear. I want you to notice the scientific tools that they are using for building up their energy and their muscle. And this again is an example of the high-tech, high-quality that was associated with the United States ski jumping team in 1964. So, in some ways, sadly, in some ways, like all life, Valhalla, ski jumping outgrew Valhalla by 1968. A 60-meter hill was no longer big enough to hold the jumps of U.S. Olympians. There were now 75-meter hills, Copper Mountain, or Copper, I think it's Copper Mountain outside of Ironwood, was a 90-meter hill, and the U.S. ski jump team left the Washburn, the Valhalla era, and ski jumping at Valhalla said goodbye probably forever. There has not been, to my knowledge, another tournament out there. There were none in the 70s, and you will see as we go through this last part that how the earth has reclaimed the mountains, so to speak. But that wasn't an end for Valhalla. That was like so many of us. I think David mentioned that when I retired from my primary livelihood, I went to work in a related field a little bit on a part-time basis. Well, Valhalla did the same thing. It migrated. It didn't migrate out of the arena of winter sports. It migrated to what became a 70s and 80s thing in particular. The Swanson boys brought snowmobiles to Valhalla, and they came in large numbers in the 70s and 80s. This story says 125 snowmobilers gathered at Valhalla for outing on Sunday. People came to the chalet, they played cards in the chalet, they rode those old snowmobiles out from Washburn and other places like that on back trails. Probably part of the Swanson farmland was crossed in getting there, but it turned into a snowmobile mecca. Now, it is the early 70s, late 60s. One thing I have not talked about is that even from the early days, Valhalla had cross-country ski trails. Well, cross-country skiing in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s was a little bit like snow jumping. It was a Nordic sport, and very few people did it or took it seriously. But there were trails out there. And all of a sudden, the United States Forest Service, for whatever reasons, partially because it was becoming more popular, started to further develop the cross-country ski trails at Valhalla. And cross-country skiing started to take off. In fact, there's a woman in the audience tonight who has, and because time is of the essence, I will briefly tell this story, who learned cross-country skiing, and she can correct me if I'm wrong by jumping up and yelling out. She learned it from someone that most of you probably know the name of. She learned it from Dr. John Telford at Asheville Bay. John Telford was instrumental in developing the wonderful cross-country ski trails at Mount Asheville Bay that exist today, and I think John still sometimes even these days tends those trails at Asheville Bay. And she tells a story about how in the 70s, her name, Rita Steele, tells the story of how she and her friends went to Asheville Bay, or went to Valhalla, in the early 70s and tested the cross-country ski trails there. Some of those cross-country skiers were more into cross-country skiing than a couple of the others. And if you've ever been out there, now Mr. Swanson will know this, and Mr. Pilot and a few others, there's a place called the Sun Bowl. About, if you, as the crow flies from Valhalla, or as the trails go from Valhalla, maybe 3 to 4 miles from County Trunk C, if you're going back kind of to the north and east. And it's a wide open bowl, no trees in it even back in those days. She took her friends cross-country skiing out there. They were going for a small or a short cross-country ski trip. And all of a sudden, one of the ladies started to ask or question when they were going to turn around. There were at the time virtually no signs. Today, the cross-country ski trails, thanks to the Forest Service and others, are well marked. They ended up way out near the edge, the far edge of the Sun Bowl. And it was a long ski back, especially for those people who were only sort of enthusiasts. But an example of how Valhalla was remaking itself in the 1970s. Valhalla was remaking itself as a sliding hill for young people in the 1970s. Never the big hill, always the side hills close to the chalet. But Valhalla was alive with young people, snowmobilers, cross-country skiers, continuing to remake itself. And then, like all lives, there was a tragedy. Really a heartbreaking tragedy. Because in January of 1975, the old chalet, the original chalet, taken from the pine forests of the Chequamegon National Forest, constructed by men in the CCC. I never learned why, but one story was that it might have been arson. The more likely story, because Valhalla was a popular place for young people for a variety of reasons. That chalet was magnificent. Anybody that was in that old chalet, I don't think to a person walked out of it without having their mouth a little wider open than when they walked in. The woods and the beams and all that kind of stuff, it had burned to the ground, and with it, very, very sadly, some great history that cannot be recaptured. Remember that Valhalla was started in the 30s, the chalet was built in the 30s. There was no electricity in the 30s out that far. And so, one of the things that they had to do was light it. And in this picture, you will notice an inside view of the old chalet. And in the upper right-hand corner, you will notice a chandelier. And do people in this audience know what a wood burl is? Well, for those of you who don't know, a wood burl is actually a cancerous growth, sometimes non-cancerous tumor that is larger than a knot on a tree. It is a protrusion. And it is the hardest, or becomes the hardest part of the tree, because the nodules continue to grow into this burl while the tree is growing. And so what they did as a basis to light that chalet in the 1930s is they cut those burls off of some of those great old pines, and they routed them out. They wrapped them in steel, hung them from the ceiling, took oil and old rags, soaked the rags in oil, put them in that routed out wooden bowl, and lit Valhalla using wood burls as their lighting. The wood burls burned, of course, in the fire and are no more. There's electricity out there now. But those were great. That was a great place. What my personal, the story about Valhalla that I will never forget, that even if I have a massive cerebral hemorrhage, that part of me will still live on, is when Bill Foss And Bob Lindsay, the then scout leaders in Washburn, took the 1960s Boy Scouts out to Valhalla for a weekend. And what I remember about that weekend is there was an old-style Victrola in the chalet. And the fire was blazing in the fireplace on one end, and the fire was blazing in the big, massive stove at the other end. And there was only one record. And being 12 and 13 years old and being silly, the Scouts played this song over and over and over again for that whole weekend. It was a Willie Guthrie type tune. And I'm certainly not going to try to sing it or anything like that. But it is somewhat representative of those things that we most remember in our lives. And the lyrics to this song go something like this. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give me a handout to revive me again. It was a story about the bums and the hobos of the 1930s who spent their time holed up in the wintertime, and when the spring came, they jumped on the boxcars and they traveled again. And they lived off of handouts, not necessarily welfare and some of the modern things. They lived what they thought were good lives. One of the lines in that song that I only figured out later in my life after I conferred with Mr. Swanson goes, I know Jim Hill. Do any of you know Jim Hill or who Jim Hill was? Jim Hill lived in a mansion in St. Paul and Minneapolis, probably the biggest mansion in St. Paul and Minneapolis, made from Lake Superior sandstone, maybe taken from the Houghton sandstone quarry or one of the other quarries out in that area. Jim Hill was the owner, the promoter, the developer of all of the railroads that went west out of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And the lyric is, I know Jim Hill. This is the hobo singing it. He's a good friend of mine. That's why I'm traveling down Jim Hill's main line. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. That's the thing that I will never forget about my experiences at Valhalla. Now, the chalet has burned. The Forest Service has no money to reconstruct it. The Washburn's Men's Club and others get together and start to talk about rebuilding the chalet and how to do that. Well, they went back to that blueprint from 1935. Talked to the Forest Service. Forest Service has a built-in program for itself where it is allowed to harvest for its purposes a certain amount of timber off of the lands that it manages. Gave the Washburn Men's Club and other Washburn people the permission to go out into the forest and cut the timber for a new chalet. There's the story, there's the pictures, a couple of lumberjacks from the Washburn area helped with a skidder and tools and managed it. They cut all of that new wood that went into what is, for some of us, called the new chalet in 1975, and they contributed their labor. They rebuilt the chalet. Because the chalet is on Forest Service land, they had to deed the chalet back to the Forest Service, and Valhalla got a brand new, almost duplicate-looking chalet. Unfortunately, it didn't have the big fireplaces at each end, and it didn't have the ambiance of wood burl chandeliers. It didn't have an old Victrola with one record around that you could listen to. So it's the late 70s, and there's cross-country skiing, there's snowmobiling, and there's that kind of activity going on. And then I jump to today. But Valhalla's sports activities have continued on. This picture, and I want you to pay close attention to it. This picture was taken in the fall of 2017. It is standing at the base of what was the ski jump, and it's looking up at what was the main 60-meter ski jump. What it is a large scar cut in the wooded forest of this otherwise unblemished hill. And it reminds anyone who looks at it or who knows the Valhalla story that Valhalla was once the premier ski jumping place in the United States of America. That passed on to another era, and yet Valhalla changed itself again, just like we all do, remake ourselves, find new ways to do things. But you can look at this picture and say, just like all of us in this room, we have our scars that say that we have lived in this world. And when you look at this picture, you can see the scar that is left behind at the ski jump in that once was Valhalla. The next picture is a picture standing at the top, and this is where I want you to try to remember that picture when I showed you that ski jumper who was leaning out like this, and I asked you to look out onto the horizon and look at the vacant land empty of trees back in the 30s and the early 40s. Well, this is a picture, instead of looking east from Valhalla, looking west and a little bit south from the Washburn Fire Tower. It was taken in the fall of 2017, and if you look at the hilltop in the distance, you'll notice there's nothing but trees between the Washburn Fire Tower and the hill that is Valhalla. The one thing you will notice, and I will suggest again, that is that it could remind each of us of our own lives, is even from a distance, there is a scar that reminds us that this was once a premier ski jumping site. But Valhalla has not in any way, shape, or form died. It now has 78 miles of cross-country ski trails. It is 1,288 feet, as I said, above sea level. It has over 150 miles of dedicated ATV trails, with Valhalla being the centerpiece. Some of us like motorized winter and summer recreation. Some of us were not quite as comfortable with it. And yet Valhalla accommodates everybody. And that's a nice thought. Valhalla cooperates with the motorized sports, the downhill sports, and what is called, or are called, the quiet sports, cross-country skiing. And most recently, in the last couple of years, Valhalla has welcomed the quiet sport of fat tire bike riding. Winter, spring, summer, fall. On the same trails that are used by the cross-country skiers, on the same trails that are used by the snowshoers. Now, there are bikers those big fat tire bikes that have aren't high pressured but can travel on snow and things like that. And kids are being taught to use those trails for bike purposes. And this other season, or this other quiet sport, is growing into something that Valhalla will be able to continue, just like in our lives. Our children and grandchildren take over for us. Here's another example of something taking over and Valhalla welcoming it and nurturing it and making it part of its own legacy. This photo that I'm giving to Lloyd right now is a picture of the solitude that you can find on a bike on those trails in the middle of winter. And it reminds us to keep hoping for more of these things. The next photo, and the final photo that I have available, some of them, and I have to say that I missed some because of that presentation, but this is showing that same quiet sport in 2017, not as a solitude, or not in its solitude, but in its ability to be a socializer, to welcome people to join together and to go out and celebrate what is Valhalla. And for those of you who have lived with Valhalla in your life, for those of you who are new to the Washburn area, when I say new, you came here in the last 50 years. That's when I grew up here back 50 years ago, so that's why I use that measuring stick. I'm only 37, but still it was 50 years ago that I used the measuring stick from. Valhalla is out there. Valhalla is alive. Valhalla is a metaphor, at least for me, of a human life. It has a beginning, a new birth. It had a joyous youth. It had a period where it had to get down to business and take care of something like a world war. It had a period where it started to have kids and it had to be responsible and find a job. It had a rebirth in its midlife in the 1960s. And when ski jumping retired it because it got too old and too feeble, Valhalla found a new way to make itself over again. And Valhalla continues to this day, and my guess is well beyond our lifetimes, Valhalla will be that metaphor for those who look for it in its story. Valhalla will be a part of the land of northern Wisconsin and the Chequamegon Peninsula. Valhalla will remind us all that no matter what, life goes on. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk with you. And I do see a question. So I'd be happy to take other questions.
What's the meaning of the word?
Oh yes, very, very good. If we had the multimedia, you would have learned that on the first slide. Valhalla. We don't know why Chick Sheridan and Hans Thompson chose that word to describe this area. But Valhalla is a Nordic term, and it means a place where Nordic heroes and heroines go to celebrate and dine with the Nordic god Odin for eternity. And you'll notice if you look at the cross-country ski trails that they're also Nordic names. Valkyrie, Teuton, words like that. These were Nordic people who put Valhalla on the map in this part of the country for a variety of reasons. These are people who honored it with a name like that, celebrating the fact that heroes and heroines whether they're Olympic ski jumpers or they groom the landing area with an old bed spring, seem to be welcome in the dining room of the God Order. So, yes, sir.
What was the elevation separation from the top to the bottom?
That is a good question, and one I do not know the answer to. All I can tell you is that, as I told you about the toboggan run, and as I told you about the original professional downhill run, it is steep enough that it never developed into an alpine skiing area because of that, the steepness of the elevation, whether it was 500 feet or 800 feet or something in that area. All I know is that it's above sea level, is in the 12 to 1300 feet range, and on the Chequamegon Peninsula, it is called a mountain. Mount Valhalla. Not just Valhalla, Mount Valhalla. Other questions or stories? Yes, ma'am.
Was the new lodge built on the site of the old lodge?
The new lodge was built exactly on the site of the old lodge. It was the same sacred ground that the new lodge was built on. If you looked at a picture, or you had a picture of the lodge, looking down of the lodge in 2017, you would notice some differences, but you would notice that it is located in exactly the same place as where it was originally placed in the 1930s.
When was the ski jumper moved?
They're actually, very interesting question in case people didn't hear it. When was the ski jump removed? Well, there was only a brief period of time that there actually was a scaffolding on Valhalla. For most of the, well, all of the 30s and 40s and into the 60s, there was no scaffold. The hill was steep enough. If you started out at the top and you hit the jump area, you had enough velocity to carry you off that hill. In fact, to carry you off that hill and to set Valhalla's jump record without a scaffold. The scaffold was added in the 1960s during the time that the U.S. ski jump team trained there to give them a little bit more velocity, because 193 feet, even 200 feet, was becoming something that wasn't competitive in world ski jumping. And once the ski jump, or once the U.S. Ski Association relinquished its agreement with the U.S. Forest Service in the late 60s, the scaffold that was there during those 4 or 5 years was removed, as was the judges' stand and other structures there. Now there is something else about Valhalla that few people know, and this reminded me that when it was originally built, there was a warming house built as well. And that warming house burned down, I believe, in the 1950s or something like that. And then that one photo that's going around where the ski jump team is doing their summer exercise routines, you can see the old limestone fireplace from that warming house in the background. Valhalla never had running water. I don't believe it has running water to this day. Pump. Valhalla never had indoor plumbing. I don't believe to this day Valhalla has indoor plumbing. I think there are pit toilets near the chalet, at least as I recall. I should say Mount Valhalla has those things. I should be respectful of it. And other questions? Yes, Jim?
Well, I'm going to put my 2 cents worth in here, because I started with the Forest Service in September 3rd, 1948. and I retired from there in 1984. I had 33 years of service. And this coming Friday, I'll be 88 years old, and I've been retired 33 years from there. So, I know all about the house, and I took care of
We lived
it,
it.
maintained it for many years. One of the things that, I don't know, maybe some of these people are participating in is the parties in Northland College there.
Yes. If those of you in the back can't hear what Jim DeBell is saying, and it is short-sighted on my part not to have spent a little more time on this, is Valhalla was for young people. Not just the college kids from, Jim says, Northland College, but for the high school kids who needed to learn a lot of different things. Where and how to celebrate, how to use alcohol, how to interact with the, in some instances, young women, in some instances, young men of their same age group. Valhalla was a great place for young people to gather to do that. Sometimes to the dismay, I bet, Jim, of the U.S. Forest Service because of what they left behind.
Monday mornings was bad.
Monday mornings were bad, says Jim.
Now, they usually bought a brand new garbage can, big one though, and everybody brought a bottle, dumped it in there, whatever they brought. And it was a 55-gallon drum of empty whiskey bottles on Monday morning. Quite a mess to clean up.
A 55-gallon drum of empty whiskey bottles on Monday mornings. Pretty big mess to clean up. Young people, probably between the ages of, in Lloyd Swanson's case, 12 and 21 or older, 22, spending time at Valhalla in a way that wasn't exactly what the Forest Service had in mind for the use of the facility.
And speaking of the trails, I walked every one of those trails and laid them out on foot, put the ribbons up. Sometimes you had to go back and do it over. And afterwards, I bulldozed all those trails. It took a lot of walking.
Given the number of miles of trails, Jim, and the number of miles of trails,
Miles?
there's like 78 of them.
Arthritis today.
Yeah, and some of them, the more mild trails are on the east side of County Trunk C, going out towards the Sun Bowl. There are some cross-country ski trails out there. I've actually, in younger years, attempted to ski them, that are vicious ski trails.
Whatever they are, I built them all.
You built them all. So if we honor Jim DeBell for building those ski trails, we honor him for all the times that we've fallen on those ski trails, all the times we wanted to get back to the chalet and not ever come back to these steep ski trails, and yet we came back, at least in my case, for a 20-year period of time. I brought friends here. We skied those ski trails at Mount Asheville Bay, or Mount Valhalla, and loved. Yes, Jim.
The red barn down there in the west end of town,
Yes.
that was the garage for the caretaker.
Ah,
Well, that got moved in, Roddy Burgos.
Roddy Burgos.
Beer joint out of it.
Yeah.
And the caretaker's house sits 2 blocks up from the foundry on the corner.
Ah, very interesting.
That was moved in, and I forget, and they told me their friend's name, but I forget who lives there. But it's right on the corner, left-hand side, and it goes 2 blocks up.
Jim talks about the garage and it being Annabelle's place or Rod Burgos' place. And for those of you who are older and have lived in Washburn all of your lives, starting out with when I dedicated this to John Foltz, Annabelle and Rod were John Foltz's aunt and uncle. And just shows that the circle goes round and round. Yep, Annabelle and Rod were John Foltz's aunt and uncle. And I'm going to end this with a bit of trivia. And there may be somebody in this audience who knows. I'm guessing somebody like Jim DeBell might know, and if he does, he's not free. I won't call on him because I kind of suspect he might know this. But when when the Catholic school, what is now for most of you the old abandoned Catholic school as far as a school, was new in 1965, there still existed on the property, the Catholic property up there, the first Catholic church that was built in Washburn in the 1880s, the early 1890s. The parish sold the church off because what we called the new school was going to fill in part of, or take up part of that building. They sold it off to a resident of Washburn. That building, like Annabelle's place, like the house up off of the Foundry, still lives in Washburn today. It is still used on a daily basis. Does anybody in this audience know where in the city of Washburn that building rests? Oh, Nancy Bruno Anderson.
I think Jewel Olsen bought.
Nancy Bruno Anderson wins the prize. Jewel Olsen bought that building, had it hauled down to the corner where the Olsens lived of Pine Street and 7th Avenue on the north side, and turned it into his garage. And even today, when you drive up West 7th Avenue, you can see that building sagging in the middle, those kind of things, but still being used as the garage for whoever the current tenants of that building are. But that's where the old Catholic Church resides. And again, thank you very much for letting me bother you for this time. And it's fun to come back to Washington.